Okay, well, welcome back to Chat with the Mindful Beekeepers, everyone. We are glad to have you back. I see Les is on and everybody's trickling in. It's nice to see you guys. Tonight, we're going to talk about what's happening in Australia as a theme for getting us started. But if you have questions, ask them in the chat below and or in the comments on YouTube, and we'll get you guys going. So Les, I've heard, we were talking with JJ of the Hive Jive. We just did the recording for the weekly podcast. And apparently they've found some varroa in some monitor hives around Newcastle on the east coast of Australia. And so they are basically destroying all colonies that are around that area. And some beekeepers lose a lot of money based on that. There's this guy that was talking about $250,000 because they were going to go and destroy all of his hives because they found some there as well. And then there's another city, and there's a big old drama unfolding, right, Les? What's going on? Tell us a little bit about it.
Well, hopefully we got some Australian beekeepers. We've had them in the past. But I've seen this play out in the United States. And initially the goal is eradication. And often, like I see where they found mites 10 kilometers from the original mite they found. Mm-hmm. Found one mite in a hive. And then 10 kilometers away, they found some more. It may be too late, but they're going to try, apparently they're going to try to eradicate. I've seen this play out in New Mexico when my former boss wanted to call a meeting, heard the mite was coming. He had 4,000 hives. He was desperate not to have varroa mite. So he said, if we see any mites, we should eradicate. And the thing is, it was in Colorado, it was in Texas. It was all around us, Arizona. So I felt like, well, it's going to be here. We can't eradicate. Then we finally found it in my old former boss's bees. And he decided he didn't want to eradicate after all.
When it's okay when it's the other people, but once it's in your backyard, it's a different story, right?
And he was like, you know what, never mind. We'll medicate. They call it medicate. But
it's fine now.
So hopefully they won't get too many more hives burned up or whatever, however they do the eradication.
They also,
eventually, I mean, in talking to the Australian beekeepers on this podcast, we've talked about the idea that it's inevitable that they're eventually going to get the varroa mite. And I'm sorry that they have it. I wish they could go on forever without it. But they have it, and it's not the end of the world. There's lots of hope at the end of the tunnel, as we well know.
Well, they're definitely in a much better position than we have been for the last, well, we're better now, but they have the advantage of having a heads up, of having all that research that's been done, of understanding how the mite functions and its life cycle and how to potentially affect it. They also have the advantage of seeing interventions that can help mitigate the issues. They've seen how natural selection and breeding for resistance and tolerance is helping out, all the strategies that the bees can develop on their own. They've seen, the treatment companies come up with some products that help when you're wanting to go that way. And basically all the education, they're on the lookout. They already know what to look for. They're not going to get caught off guard. So from that standpoint, there's a lot of good news as well for them, specifically being one of the last place to get varroa mite infestations.
Right, that's a good point, that they've got us to lean on, and I'm happy to help. One thing that could be helpful would be to import semen from VSH and grooming bees, not import bees, because that often brings up more trouble than,
or
yeah.
parasites.
But if they would import some semen and artificially inseminate and then breed bees from those queens, they could try to get a jump start on their breeding for mite resistance. Also, I firmly believe that the mites have been breeding themselves to better fit Apis mellifera
Right.
for a long time. And so it may not be nearly as devastating. When we first got it here, yeah, it was very devastating. And it took about 10 years to kind of modulate. And I hope, well, we'll see. They've been pretty protected. So we're going to have to see what happens.
It's definitely going to be a shock to their system. There's definitely going to be some losses and some drastic interventions that are going to decrease the populations of their honeybees. And it all is happening. They have another advantage, is that this is taking place right where they're still in the basically winter season, hasn't started yet. And so that plays to their advantage because they have the time to try to catch it before it explodes in the spring, right? So pretty soon they'll go on blueberry and I forget what other crop pollination. So that might be impacted, and the almond pollination afterward will be impacted as well, potentially very seriously, and affects the food supply as well as the income and the livelihood of those beekeepers. But in the meantime, there's an advantage to having that lull for them to try and get ahead of the problem. So to your point, by the way, it took a few years, but some of the beekeepers in the United States that chose the path to natural selection ended up being some of the top providers of Varroa resistant and tolerant strains in the United States. Here in Texas, we've seen it with the weavers, right? In that story where he had thousands of hives and decided first he had to destroy some of those hives. I think it was in Minnesota. And but in Texas, he was able to just kind of, let them fend for themselves. And he did lose hundreds, potentially thousands of colonies that way as well, and was left with a very small population on part of their experiment. And once that population proved out to be more tolerant, more resilient in the face of the pest, then he started breeding from those. And now he's way ahead of the curve 30 years later, right? Compared to those who have chosen the miticides approach and just kind of medicated their bees and not giving them an opportunity to develop their own resistance.
Right. And so that was, people who are looking ahead for a biological solution sometimes have to take that cost at the beginning, but they are the hope of the future. I remember being in a similar situation where I was supposed to supply queens and most of my bees had died from the Varroa mite. And I couldn't supply the queens, and people were telling me, Les, Apistan works, what are you doing? And I was like, well, it's not going to keep working. And a few years later, I was back to being able to supply a few queens. And they were being devastated because they were using Apistan and had quit working. And they lost a lot of bees. And that's when they had to go to checkmate or Coumaphos, because the mites had become resistant to Apistan. And then I bit my tongue, but I kept thinking, they told me, less Apistan works. Yeah, look ahead. It's not going to work forever. And that's our long-term goal should be a biological solution. And we can start looking ahead at ourselves. Like, here's AAA leps. I heard a lot about AAA leps in the past. I haven't heard about it recently. But it's another mite from Asia that we could worry about. Could we begin looking for drones of AAA lapse resistant for Apis mellifera already, and importing semen from them and getting ready for future biological problems with biological solutions. Yeah.
So yeah, so that kind of brings back, a lot of sensitive topics, even in the United States. But Bruce is making a point on YouTube. He's like, basically, Australia is prolonging the inevitable, right? Delaying. And it's kind of what's happened here. It took about 30 years, and people are finally switching over more to the less medication and more natural approach for selection of stronger, more resilient, and more tolerant strains, right?
Well, initially there was a famous quote that nobody wants to claim anymore that said that breeding bees resistant to Varroa is like breeding lambs resistant to wolves.
Yes.
And basically saying it can't be done. And that quote was quoted quite often to discourage people from believing in Varroa resistance.
Mm-hmm.
But Thomas Rinder didn't believe it, and I didn't believe it. And Thomas Rinder went to Russia and found the Russian bees that were indeed mite resistant and finally imported them. And we could pass them on to the Australians through the semen and help them get that much ahead by breeding grooming behavior into their bees as quickly as possible. And yeah, but I totally agree with Bruce. The eradication program the way it happened in the United States was they found one hive in Florida. They started looking, they started finding more. And a bunch of beekeepers got afraid of a quarantine because they were pollinators overwintering in Florida. And a quarantine would put them out of business. And they were already struggling, and that would be bankruptcy. So they moved quickly to get out of Florida before the quarantine and thinking, well, we'll quickly get away from the mite, only to realize they already had the mite, and the mite just jumped wherever they went that quickly, and it became impossible. Eradication became a pipe dream that would never work. They would have had to destroy all the bees they could find, and that would have been devastating. And I don't know when that's going to happen in Australia, where they're going to realize, well, we can't just keep killing bees. We have to stop and start dealing with the mites.
Well, that brings up a really good point. And while we discuss this, by the way, this is our theme, but we are still here to answer your questions, guys. So if you want to jump in, or if you want to type your questions into the comments or the chat, just do that. We'd love to have your questions and answer them for your local area. Just let us know where you're at if you're not in Texas, so that we can kind of adapt to your weather. But the point is, there was one of the largest, the guy that was standing to lose about $250,000 worth of bees. He had his own queen breeding program. He was rearing his own genetics that were adapted to the local area. And so asking him to destroy all his colonies is basically destroying that amount of diversity into their genetic pool, right? So there's a loss that probably cannot be replaced. And so
Right.
It's a little drastic to go in that way, especially having a jump start on things. But we all know how organizations that are in charge will jump in, and in this case, they're trying to prevent the problem from spreading and be devastating. But I'm sure that there might be ways to mitigate that so that it doesn't become all or nothing kind of a thing, right?
Right. If they would initiate a ban on moving bees, that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that still puts people out of business.
Yes.
If there's any pollinators for the almonds and the blueberries and so forth. Right. But at least that would be better than killing the bees. And when they kill that man's bees, that's his life's work.
Yeah.
That's in a sense his he celebrated those bees over many years. And now you're taking his life's work and saying we're going to trash it. And instead of letting him start to work with those bees and see which ones are the most mite resistant and breed from those. And that's what we eventually need to start doing in Australia, because I think it's pretty inevitable. I've been amazed that they've kept it off as long as they have. Australia is pretty good at protecting its agriculture.
Yeah.
But the mites are very ingenious, and there's been swarms. That's the other thing, is there's been Apis cerana swarms found, and they are bound to carry the mite.
Yeah.
And Apis mellifera swarms found on ships. So it's inevitable that eventually they're going to get the mite.
Right. So they did have a prior infestation of mites, but they were the Asian, the ones that were specialized in the Asian honeybees. And they were able to eradicate that one. And it was not as damaging as the Varroa destructor that specializes in European honeybees that they're getting observed now, that are probably coming in on shipping containers undetected, right?
Right.
But Margaret's asking, aside from sharing genetics of Varroa resistant stock, are there other things we can do to support beekeepers in Australia, or maybe help share the futility of eradication? A little bit like, you want to remind us of the story of, is it Puerto Rico or Jamaica? Well, both actually, right?
Right.
What's the story there, and how are they proving basically that very point?
So the Jamaicans got the Varroa mite, and a lot of Jamaican beekeepers depend on feral bees to go get colonies, and for their expansion, they would find feral bees. There's a kind of a symbiotic relationship in Jamaica with termites, which build these big sort of masonite-like structures up in a tree a little ways. And there's apparently enough hollow space in them. The bees often go and live inside these termite nests. And they're fairly easy to break apart and get the bees out and put them in your beehive. And so there's a lot of feral beekeeping in Jamaica. And when the Varroa mite came, it really knocked them back. Now the Minister of Agriculture mandated that everybody in Jamaica had to use Apistan. And his brother-in-law sold all the Apistan to the government to give to the beekeepers. But a lot of the beekeepers in Jamaica were Rastafarian, which is a sort of a quasi-religion. And one of their tenets is absolutely agriculture should be organic, and that everybody should be involved in organic agriculture, and you do not use pesticides. So they refuse. A lot of them are beekeepers because they're vegan, and in their view, honey is much better for them and much less socially irresponsible than sugar. So a lot of them are beekeepers, and they refuse to use the Apistan. And it took them a few years of letting their bees just be killed. And they started getting more and more feral bees out of the trees that had become mite resistant. So when I went to talk, I asked them, I said, we should be breeding for mite resistance. And you've been using Apistan too long. It probably isn't doing any good anymore. And so then one of the Rastafarians said, well, we never used that, and my bees are fine. They were hard on them at first, but now they're fine. And that made the other beekeepers think, wait a minute, now we're spending hundreds of Jamaican dollars to treat bees, and you're not treating and your bees are fine? And it became a quick change. They quickly dropped toxic pesticides in Jamaica. They never were able to use them in Puerto Rico. A lot of beekeepers just couldn't afford them. They couldn't get them. And that forced them to become mite resistant. And it forced the mites to breed with the bees and calm their breeding rate down a bit so that they could live symbiotically with the bee. So that's what and probably that's already happened to a lot of the bees that are in Asia that came over to Australia now. But that's going to have to be determined. We'll have to see what level of susceptibility the Australian bees have to this particular variety of varroa mite. It may not be that devastating, actually.
Right. I mean, this is a little bit of the same thing happened in Africa as well. A lot of those countries or beekeepers there didn't have the means to treat and use what is over there additional expenses that they don't necessarily need or even can find the treatments. And so the proof was in the pudding, right? It's just kind of they had no choice but to let the bees go and do their thing. And a toll was taken, but in the end, their bees are thriving now. Excuse me.
Right. And the thing about the, I forgot.
Yeah. That not welcome to the club. That happens to me all the time. I've got Aiden that's asking a question on Zoom. He's they're asking, I installed a new package in a Taba hive in mid-June. Can you remind me how I should be thinking about feeding them during the summer and any other tips to keep them going with this local South Austin weather? So Aiden, it depends what you're seeing in there. First of all, if they do need feeding or not. A lot of our colonies we haven't fed at all because there's been quite a bit of nectar with a lull and a dearth coming through in some areas, but not very serious. They contracted back a little bit and stopped or decreased their brood rearing. But it is true that a package needs feeding, and usually during the dearth, especially to get ahead of the curve before the winter. So we, if they're bringing in resources and a lot of nectar, they're probably not going to take the feeding. If they're not and they're contracting back, then we usually recommend a quart of simple syrup, 1-to-1 sugar to water every 5 to 7 days, right? And because it does ferment really quick, you don't want to put much more than that. If you do give them more than that, the bees might take it because they have a natural tendency to hoard resources if they have the space. However, very quickly, that means they can backfill their brood nests, and that might mean that when the queen is wanting to resume egg laying, then she might not have all the space that she needs, and that might negatively impact the level of that population, which might stagnate or decrease as the older foragers die out trying to find resources. So you have to be very careful to not overfeed them. But I'm going to let Les reply to this question as well, because I think his philosophy is right on this.
Well, yeah, and I'll quote Michael Bush one more time. If you look in your beehive and there's no honey or sugar or nectar, they're hanging by the skin of their teeth, they're about to starve to death, that's an emergency. There's nothing wrong with feeding them. But if you have that emergency year after year, it's not an emergency, it's mismanagement. And what that means is, well, and it could be bad luck with the flowers, but what he means is maybe you have too many bees, or you took too much honey. A lot of people should be waiting on their honey harvesting right now because we don't know what kind of, hopefully this rain that we caught just today and maybe tonight is going to help with honey production later, but we don't know. And so nothing wrong with leaving the honey for a while. But so in your case, I'd like to know how many combs the bees have. And if there's honey in a fair amount of those combs, I just kind of suspect there is because we had a pretty good spring. And a lot of bees did put up some honey. And some bees are still actually building a little bit, or at least holding their own. Some are contracting a bit. But I haven't seen anybody going through all their honey stores and starving to death. So I wouldn't worry too much about it. But I just want to make sure that if they get up to 5 or 6 combs at least, and that there's a fair amount of honey in some of those combs, so that they can weather the dearths and little bits of honey flow that we have through the rest of this year, sometimes we get a really good fall flow. That's just going to depend on hurricanes and Gulf disturbances and the weather that we get up here, and see what it does to the flowers. And then hopefully we'll get through our mild winter, and hopefully it'll be a mild winter. You know, in some ways, a beehive is a pretty precarious house of cards.
Mm-hmm.
When you really think about it, it's amazing how well they do year after year. They depend on millions of flowers and storing the residue from millions of flowers, protecting them from all kinds of parasites and predators, and sneaking through the dearths and surviving on the produce of flowers. And so it's a pretty delicate thing that seems to work year after year after year.
Well, and I mean, as a package, if they do have, like Les mentioned, they look like they have enough resources. You don't want to provide that too much, and just kind of a trickle throughout the summer. And, you know, if they're looking like they need it, though, basically just feed them a little bit more. But I wouldn't do more than a couple quarts every week, honestly, to avoid backfilling.
Yeah, and that's fine. I haven't been feeding them actually, but I just, with travel coming up and so on, I just didn't want to abandon them. So they do seem like they have just stalled out maybe a little bit, but
Right.
I haven't really done a full inspection. But they're not getting bigger, I would say, but there is honey in there. So
Right. And that's your first colony in the top bar hive, or?
no, but it's been 6 years since the first one I installed, and
Okay.
one forgets.
Right. And you probably didn't have any resources to try to catch a swarm by then.
No, I'm not going to do that.
So very good. Well, thanks for your question, Aidan.
Mhm.
Margaret, do you know if Australia has a large feral honeybee population? My sense is that feral colonies seem more adaptable and resistant than colonies maintained by keepers using standard treatment options. Yes, that's kind of the general consensus, although commercial beekeepers or people that do beekeeping for a living, they tend to, or actually anyone, there's been a fear mongering about feral colonies that there might introduce some disease and pests into your apiaries. And I mean, I don't know, Les, what do you think? I think personally they bring in genetic diversity and over time increased resiliency. But, you know, I would never requeen a feral colony or a swarm that I'm catching just because. I would never ever do that, because they could be very well fantastic bees, right?
Yeah, I've had some wonderful bees that I've caught in water meters that I was told if they're in water meters, they're Africanized and they're going to be real mean. And when I caught them, they weren't mean. As they developed, they never became really mean bees at all, and very hardy bees. And you know, I brought this subject up to Dr. Eric in California, Musson, and he has now passed away, which I'm sorry to hear because he was a great bee research scientist. But he and I really disagreed over the varroa resistance issue. And he was of the opinion that all the feral bees hadn't died yet, but that they were going to die because nobody was protecting them from the mites. And I was of the opinion that they were doing fine because nobody was protecting them from the mites. And he would usually get pretty angry with me. And I didn't get angry with him, but I wouldn't back down, you know. And so then Tom Seeley did a study in his Ithaca, New York forest, where he was monitoring feral colonies and kept colonies in a little meadow near his feral bee hives that he was so in love. Tom is much more interested in wild bees than he is in how to increase honey production for beekeepers. He's interested in natural bee biology. So he was worried that the kept bees were going to be bringing genes into his feral colonies, like varroa miticide dependence. So would the bees that were being treated weaken his mite-resistant feral bees? And what he found was that there was gene migration, but it was not from the kept colonies into the feral bees. It was from the feral bees into the kept colonies. And that's because the feral bees the drones had higher sperm counts, more longevity. The queens were more fertile and lived longer. And so it was pretty much a vindication that the feral bees were better bees.
They're more fit.
And that our treatments were weakening the bees. And a lot of our, so to me that was, and Eric Musson wouldn't listen to an average beekeeper because he didn't have a PhD, but Tom Seeley did. And that meant that he had to listen to Tom Seeley. And he said, well, there may be an exception up in Ithaca, New York. Well, that just happened to be where Tom was. But there are lots of mite-resistant feral bees all over the United States. I have had them in New Mexico, Northern California, and here in Texas.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. The Bio Beekeeper on YouTube is saying they're keeping feral bees in Colorado as their only breeding stock, as a matter of fact. And then, he's saying basically for Australia, they should boost their numbers, and then that would counter the losses. And instead of treating, if that ever becomes something that they are instructed to do. Sometimes we don't have a choice when we're not in charge of what's going on, the rules. Basically, we don't make the rules, but that's something to keep in mind. And I just lost the rest of the, so Flo question. So, he was saying that's what I do in my big hives by splitting, as well as the small ones. Everything has been treatment free for 10 years. And so just like I never used any treatments, and I know you've been treatment free for 30 years and plus, counting actually probably more like 35 years, right? And then he's got a question, full questions. How many days after a rain? And by the way, we are so happy we got finally some rain. So this is a very apropos question. How many days after a rain would you expect the flowers to start producing nectar again, Les?
Well, nature can be pretty variable, but pretty amazing. I've seen some flowers bloom a few days after a rain, or like the Texas sage that we have around here can respond. It's sitting there waiting, and as soon as we get a good rain, shortly thereafter, maybe in a few days, it will bloom. Other plants will take a little longer, but that's good because you don't want it all in a couple of days and then be over. I hope we catch a good rain. Here in San Antonio, we haven't caught much yet. But I'm glad you got some up in Dripping Springs.
Yeah, it's been raining on and off quite a bit for the last hour and a half, 2 hours, and some pretty good downpours. So this is really good for my area. And remember, beekeeping is local. So sometimes it takes a little while after the rain. Some flowers will get nectar faster, right? So
right, and so what I've noticed comes back into bloom is Texas sage. It's already kind of just getting past its bloom, but it may rebloom. And then that's staghorn milkweed. Sometimes puts on another bloom after a good rain. It's already put on a pretty good bloom, and it's going to seed, but it could bloom again with a good rain. And some of the sumacs might bloom with a rain. So so rain is always a good thing. Well, it can get to be too much, but that's not a problem now.
Right, exactly. So Margaret says, coming back to Australia, do we know if Australia has a large feral honeybee population? And her sense is that feral colonies seem more adaptable and resistant than colonies maintained by keepers using standard treatment options. Back to what we were just talking about, basically, right?
Right. And so I don't know about the feral population of Australia. I'm pretty sure there is somewhat of a feral population, but because there always tends to be bees don't stay put in hives.
Mhm.
But their problem is that they haven't been exposed to veromite to test themselves yet, but they'll be the ones that suffer the most at first and then come back the quickest once they develop that resistance. And one thing we can do is try to help them by trying to encourage programs where they import semen from survivor stock
Mhm.
to jumpstart the veromite resistant movement in their bees as soon as possible. And ideally that would have been started already.
Yeah.
But they need to get that started, and just import the semen so they don't have to break any agricultural ban on movement of bees.
Mhm.
But by importing semen artificially inseminating queens, letting those queens produce some queens naturally that have the natural mite resistance in them, the grooming, VSH, various traits, we can help them jumpstart their natural resistance to veromite.
Yes, very good. I've got several questions. One is very local. Aiden, she's saying she's got some 17-inch bar from another hive that are 19-inch, and they're slightly too small for the hive, and she's not changed out the bars to 20 inches, just like we did, right? Because I I stubbornly had stuck to 19 inches to try to put them into Langstroth to grow and get started on some tabarcombe naturally. And then I figured out after several tries to try to transport tabar nukes that were grown on those shorter bars that they were falling through more easily, and especially in those easy transport corrugated plastic white transport nukes, they're too short. So we're going with 20, even 21 in some instances now, right, Les?
Right. Which is back to where it started.
Right. Back when you were telling me, yes, I know. I'm pretty hard-headed and I should have listened, but sometimes you got to learn for yourself.
But yeah, there is no standard topper hive. And
No. There is a standard Taba hive. That's the Les Crowder Be Mindful new standard that's being disseminated everywhere.
see, I hope that would be nice. But what I have done is, and the Brandon Freenkamp and I were talking about that this weekend in Conroe, was taking a long bar, getting your shorter bar, and literally screwing it right underneath the long bar, particularly if it isn't very thick. And then you may have to trim the comb a little bit is the only thing, because some of those combs are way too deep for the different style of beehive that you're trying to put them in.
Yeah,
that can be a bit of a mess.
Yeah,
but
it's
it can
a
be
little
done.
bit traumatic. And one of my customers got a tabarnuk made out for her. That was exactly what you just mentioned, where they took bars that were shorter and screwed them onto the longer final bars. But it does take away from the depth of your comb a little bit.
Right.
Okay, so Kathy, when you collect a swarm, is your plan to sell the colony or to keep it? If you plan to sell it, do you keep the colony for a period of time before you decide to sell it? And if yes, how long do you keep it? So in Texas, the law says that you cannot sell removal bees or bees that you haven't validated and checked for a year, I believe, at least one cycle. And I don't know if that applies to swarms, but it definitely applies to removal bees and cutouts and things like that. So, and if you're asking about Be Mindful, usually we love to keep those swarms, right? Because we want to see what they're doing, because there might be gold potentially in there, and we might be able to use them to produce more colonies. Les, what's your take on keeping a swarm and all that good stuff?
Well, when we make divides, it's a little different because we've made them for that purpose and we know their origin. When you catch a swarm, you really don't know anything about it until it shows itself. So I would keep it, let it build some comb, and then see how the queen's laying. If she's laying well, that's great. If she's laying real poorly or something, then I wouldn't want to sell that to anybody, because that would detract from my reputation as well.
Right.
It just wouldn't be right. And so I would wait and let them build a little comb and see how the queen lays. And
Right.
if she's laying very well, I don't care if she looks kind of old or small or big or whatever. I mean, I like her to be big, but I mainly like her to lay well.
Right. So basically, short answer is we won't sell our swarms that we catch. We will basically sell only splits, is what we do,
Right.
or entire colonies that we've vetted for a while that we know what they're worth. Christine's asking, is there any concern of robbing with too small openings in the top of hives? As always, it depends what the size of your colony is, what's going on around, if there's a dearth, how much resources are in there, just kind of how well they're able to defend themselves. A large colony, you just kind of adapt the number of openings and their size to the traffic and the population of the hive, and basically the ability that they have to defend themselves. So we tend to recommend to close down as much as possible, just leave enough for them to go by their business unimpeded. But if it's a small colony, especially, close it down even more, potentially even to a finger, if that's a smaller colony that needs to be able to defend themselves. Les, what's your take on that question?
Well, you want to make sure that drones can come and go, and
Mhm.
that's all you need. So if you have a small colony and we're going into a dearth, I haven't seen any real robin yet, but that's no fun once it gets started. And so then you don't want to open your hive and expose it a lot. Any honey, like you get honey on your hive tool, the bees follow you around and then find out that there's honey in another beehive. If they can try to take it, they will. And so you don't want to get robbing started by exposing the hive, the honey of the hive, to the air too much. And then if they get started, making the entrance just big enough for a drone to get in and out, 3/8 of an inch or so, shut it down as much as you can. And even introduce a robin screen over the door. And also watch for yellow jackets as robbers, because they can join the robbing, or the bees and yellow jackets can start fighting a weak colony.
Mhm.
And if you get a really weak colony, you may consider just combining it with a strong colony to keep it from just getting robbed out.
Right. Or in some instances, I've been known to just kind of see what they're going to do, maybe boost them a little bit with some brood and give them a chance. But in the end, it might not even be worth much of the bees that are left if they get so weak. I had a customer just lost one of her Taba hives. She got a very small, sickly looking colony. And then all of a sudden they got robbed out. But even if they had been combined, they had so little left anyway that it was not even making any sense.
It wasn't any help, yeah.
Michelle, I'm a new beekeeper. I live in Austin. And then I'll get to the bio beekeepers question about comfort hives. Her bees are on a property in Ingram, away from where she lives, 2 hours away. How often should she be checking on them? Her hive was weak and swarmed at some point, and it looked like there were queen cells, but there wasn't a queen. I went to Bee Weavers and got a nuke and installed it yesterday. So I'm confused, Michelle, what that nuke has to do with your colony that was weak and swarmed. Did you combine them together, or did you give them some of the resources from it? And basically, if they had queen cells, I would go back in a couple of weeks and take a look at or a week and a half and take a look at what's going on, if there's a new queen and if there's laying going on. But swarming can bring the number on the population much lower. And that can be very disheartening to see at first, but it doesn't mean they're not going to bounce back, especially if they get a really well mated, really cool queen back. And they've got all those resources in there, all that run comb, all that food. Well, some of it flew away with the bees, but they've got plenty to get resumed. So I would go back, in a week and a half, 2 weeks less?
Yeah, and it's a delicate situation, because when they swarm, the new queen is going to emerge and then take some time and then go out and mate and take some time. And you don't see any new brood or eggs laid. And if you don't see the queen, you don't think there is a queen, but you don't necessarily know that she might be in there, just not laying yet. And so a lot of beekeepers buy a queen to requeen a hive that actually has a queen that isn't laying
Right.
yet.
And that queen gets killed. The
And
new one. Yeah.
the new one gets killed. So it's a very tricky, it may be that you needed her, but it's hard to tell. And the queen cells, they form queen cells, queen emerges, kills her sisters, and then they start tearing down those queen cells. So you may not see a lot of queen cells, but that doesn't mean there weren't any. I don't know. But if you try to check your bees every 2 weeks, particularly during the honey flow, when we get into a real dearth, you can go 3 weeks or 4 weeks maybe. And during the swarm season or when they're really growing, I try to give them a quick look once a week if I can. Just a quick check, because that can stave off a lot of cross combing if you're in a topper hive.
But when you check, you're not going through the entire brood's nest. You're just looking
Mhm.
at the back of the, we work a lot with top bars, at the outer edges of the brood's nest where they're building comb for storage of nectar. And those are the ones that tend to curve and cross comb over several bars, right?
Right, I tend to look at the very few combs in the back, maybe make a little rearrangement so that they'll build them straight. I'm trying to avoid the big, like sometimes you get a fat and skinny comb,
Mm-hmm.
like they build a comb and they're really putting it full of honey and they make it kind of bulge out into the space of the next comb over. Make
Mm-hmm.
that comb almost, or completely skip that comb. I
Mm-hmm.
try to avoid that by keeping moving the combs, keeping a building section and a back section, but that's in top bar management. Sounds like
Right.
you've got Langs because you've installed a nuke.
A nuke, yes. But
Yeah.
sometimes I would say when you have a situation like this, when it looks like the colony is swarmed and you are seeing queen cells, I would definitely wait a couple of weeks before I did anything. They're going to be fine for a while, up to 3.5 weeks. And even if there's a queen issue. So I would not jump the gun too much, because in the grand scheme of things, you might have lost a colony that had a queen. I just don't know what you mean by weak. Was it low population or something? But yes, Les, she ended up combining them is the end result. So that's one way to do it.
Yeah.
Um,
It's always good to have 2 hives. And then when in doubt, give them a comb of brood with eggs. And then if they need it, they'll raise a queen. If they don't, they'll just get a little boost.
Yep. So I want to say hi to on YouTube, and I don't know if I'm saying this right, so forgive my pronunciation, but Gisele Lamine is saying hello from Italy. Buonanotte. And pizza, everything, the icons are, that's funny. So thank you for joining us. The bio beekeeper over there says the pros and cons of the comfort hive over the top bar. So to be entirely honest, we haven't started keeping comfort hives yet. That's on our next to do. I would say probably the fact that we keep a lot of top bars and they're so easy to manage, and they provide larger combs, they're at waist level, all the stuff. I would say there are advantages to top bars that we do see. However, I do like the fact that the comfort hives are very frugal in hardware. I mean, in woodenware. They're easy to make. They're apparently very easy to rear queens with. So for that kind of things, I think that's interesting. But what's your take on the difference between topper hives and comfort hives, pros and cons, Les?
Well, we need to try some comfort hives.
Yes,
We build a few.
We are going to. It's in the works.
Put some bees in them.
Yeah.
I like Sam a lot, and I respect what he does.
Right.
So I'd be, because otherwise I'd be a little skeptical of him, and it may depend on a good honey flow. my old boss used to say, good honey flow makes us all good beekeepers. And I just would like to see how we do here in Austin area. And I'd like to find out if he uses them up in New York, or if he mainly uses them down in Florida. But I do respect Sam.
Oh, yeah.
And, you know, Sam and I attended a conference, many years ago now in Arizona. And there was all about Warre, which is kind of the stepping point where Sam decided to, because Sam's little Sam Comfort Hives are kind of his version of Warre, very simplified version of Warre. And
Ah.
he and I were there, and they said, well, you know, you got to put the box underneath the growing hive, but you have to check and see if they need it. So he had a special camera with a light that you could look up under there. It was about $700. And then if you did need to move the box up and put the box underneath it, the empty box, the nadir, he had a special little $1,500 forklift that would lift the hive because it gets heavy after you've got 5 or 6 boxes. And Sam and I both said, no, we're not doing that. That's not our style of beekeeping. Then Sam went on to invent his little Sam Comfort Hives, which I think we need to try.
Right, we are definitely going to try that. That's definitely in the plans. If we hadn't been so busy with the spring season, we would already have some. So it's our next step. But the bio beekeeper actually, what he meant was that he doesn't have enough wood or a table saw to make the top bars for a top bar hive. So he wants to try a hybrid concept of a top bar hive and comfort hive with the body of a tabar hive. He's going to put basically the bamboo skewers, and I guess it's going to be interesting. I would love to see what your concept does, because you're probably going to need a cover just like Sam does over those, because the bars are not touching. They don't form a contiguous roof over the colony. So you're going to need some kind of cover there. But also you're going to have to find bamboo skewers that are long enough, probably about 18 or 17 inch at least, to go and join the two edges of your top bar. So I would love to see what you find out with that. But if you cannot find wood, I would recommend going to all the construction areas where there's contractors that are discarding pieces of wood, 2x4s even. As long as they're about 20 inches long, you can cut sections of that are 19, 20 inches and then rip them. Oh, but you don't have a table saw. But somebody you know probably has a table saw. There's always somebody that's going to have a table saw in your neighborhood or your friend circle that can cut those bars for you. So that's something else to keep in mind. Or I've heard some people were using so basically is it 2x2s or 2x1s that are 1.5 inch wide. It might not be 1 3/8, but you might be able to get away with that. And all you would need is a circular saw or even a handsaw to cut the bars. Right, Les?
A lot of wood lath is 1 3/8.
Okay.
So you might be able to find something. And I would never, I'd like to hear what your experiment comes up with, because it's the creative minds solving a problem that make changes that are interesting. So I'd be happy to see what you're doing. And that's what started me on my top bar hives. I was back when I was a kid, the only hive there was a Lang. Nobody heard of anything else, except the old timers had log gums or just hollow trees. But that was considered primitive and, behind the backwards or whatever. So when I heard about top bar hives, people thought, oh, that's crazy. Why would you do that? They might be good for Africa, but they have nothing to do with first world beekeeping. And I had to invent my own system of top bar beekeeping. And I tried barrels and all kinds of things. And it's that creative spark at the beginning that can come up with some interesting stuff. So keep us in mind.
Yeah, so I'm sending them the free plans we have. I want to remind everybody we have free plans for our Taba hives. It's at be-mindful.com/plans. And wanted to remind you that with less than 2 hours, you can make one from scratch. And you can build it from reclaimed or free wood, or you can just buy the wood if you have access to that. And be creative for the bars. If you don't have a table saw, there's other ways to get those done. So,
And I've made the body of the Tupper hive out of mud, adobe
yes,
mud, with
yeah.
or cob, basically, with a lot of straw in it. I've made them out of plastic blue barrels, which we have a couple of those going again now. There's a lot of options. Basically, you need a box that's wider at the top than the bottom.
Right.
Ideally, a wide enough angle that they don't attach the comb very much. Turns out to be near 120 degrees. And bars across the top. And I think it's actually better if they form the ceiling. So make them 1 3/8 and make them touch each other, and throw a cover over that, and throw some bees in there and see what happens.
That's right. I forgot. The Bio Beekeeper is ambitious. He's building 5,000 boxes. And by the way, keep in mind that you can put 2 colonies and potentially 3 in a 4-foot long Taba hive with partitions. You use extra of the end pieces to use them as partitions. As long as they cannot communicate in their separate entrances, you can put several colonies in there. I wouldn't put any more than 3, but we definitely put 2 colonies to a regular Taba hive 4-foot long all the time, because that's how we raise them for ag services and all the stuff. So,
you definitely should check how comfort hives do in Colorado over winter, because you have a pretty serious winter relative to Florida.
And I think that is fantastic. The comfort hives are fantastic, but I think that if you're trying to sell these, you're probably going to get more customers on Taba hives than you will on comfort hives, because they're more ubiquitous. They're more common than the comfort hives. So far, anyway, there's a lot of people talking about the comfort hives at this point as well. So we have some time for one more question, if you'd like. Again, our theme for the day, we started with the discovery of veromites in Australia and the potential eradications of thousands of colonies over there by the government to try to control what's going on and prevent an infestation that's spreading like wildfire across the country. But definitely they've had some issues. They don't need that right now, because a couple of years ago they had all those wildfires, and they're just now recovered. That kind of took a toll on their feral population and all their colonies that were managed as well. They lost so many colonies. They don't need they're kind of at a fragile state right now, right? Let me see if we got any more questions. I don't have any more questions in Zoom. I'm not seeing any more questions in YouTube. I'm glad to see we have 9 people now on YouTube. Thank you and welcome for joining us. We're really thrilled to have you. But Les, do you have any parting words for us, words of wisdom on all of this?
Well, for the Australians, I can see the desire to import some Apistan or some Kumafas or Amatraz and start that, and maybe in an emergency, if you've got to pollinate, you've got to get your bees. But that's the short-term, toxic, dangerous solution. And I hope that and I know a lot of the Australian beekeepers are going to work on natural solutions and breed for mite resistance, as Adrian Iodice and Ralph and all those people we've talked to over this podcast. So I have a lot of hope for Australia and for the rest of us, that we will continue to find ways to keep bees without putting poison. I want to call it miticide, but I'd like to call it a poison in the hive, and that we can keep bees for thousands of years after I'm long gone. That we'll be keeping bees naturally and working with the natural biology of the bee and the mites and all the various parasites and diseases and predators that they have.
Well, there you have it, folks. If you want to learn more about ways to keep your bees more sustainably and naturally, come on back. We do this every Monday night, 7:30 p.m. Central US time, except on major holidays. So Les, are we going to do this on the 4th of July?
I couldn't miss it. It would be easier for me to miss it.
Okay, well, how about I think that the next one would have been this coming Monday. We're going to skip that one. It's going to be 2 weeks before we see you again. But after that, we'll do it every Monday night until Les leaves us for Jamaica. We might be able to get you back, though.
You might be able to get me in Jamaica because my daughter-in-law has Wi-Fi. We'll see how good it is.
That sounds good. If not, I'll do some tap dancing.
Okay.
Well, thank you guys. Thank you so much. And Les, thank you so much for sharing your expertise again. We're thrilled to have you. And thanks everyone for all your wonderful questions. You guys have a wonderful evening. And we will, the Bio Beekeepers Asking, the Zoom link is on our website at bee-mindful.com. At the bottom of the page of the homepage, you will find the Zoom link there. So we'll see you guys in 2 weeks. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie, and we'll see everybody later.